Genesis chapter 37, we'll begin reading in verse number 5. This story should be familiar to us because we have been going through the series of Joseph's life, and we're going to look at when relationships collide, dealing particularly with Joseph's life as we finish out, Lord willing, this series this morning. Genesis chapter 37, beginning in verse 5, And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it his brethren, and they hated him yet the more. And he said unto them, Hear, I pray you, this dream which I have dreamed. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaf stood round about, and made obeisance to my sheaf. And his brethren said to him, Shalt thou indeed reign over us, or shalt thou indeed have dominion over us? And they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. Dear Lord, I pray that you'll help us now as we look at Joseph's life, as we look at his situation, and we look at our relationships, and when our relationships collide and the way in which we should react. Lord, problems come. Yet if we react properly, the problems oftentimes can be solved rather than magnified. And I pray, Lord, you'll help us to learn this morning this principle and apply it into our lives and our relationships. Lord, we ask this in your name. Amen. When it comes to conflict, very few people enjoy it. Now, there are some people, I can't say no one, there are some people that love conflict. There are some people, I believe, that if they had lighter fluid and they saw a match, they would pour it all out on the match. They really would. In fact, that reminds me, we watched at camp every night. It was 20th anniversary, so they look back. Every night we watched a promotional video from years gone by. And that's both hilarious and humiliating all at the same time, because you look back and realize how big of a dork you really were. And so that was terrible. But anyway, there was this guy one time. I say guy, he was a young man. He was actually only 16, and he did some afternoon sessions at camp. And he had this fire illustration. I think he was also a pyromaniac. But he had this fire illustration, and we were having afternoon services out in the woods there at camp. On either side, there is sort of like an outdoor tabernacle. It's just some crude benches that are set up on the ground, and you sort of have where they go down to where the speaker would speak. And he's got this fire illustration, and he's got the stick lit on fire, and evidently the fire didn't spread the way he thought it should, so he takes lighter fluid, and he squirts it on this fire. Well, we're in the middle of the woods, in the summer, in the heat, in the dry. Now, this year it's been very wet, but overall it's normally dry. And sure enough, that little clip was on the video, and then you see him stamping something out where he's catching fire on the ground. And we didn't have any pyromaniacs for the past decade now, thankfully. But that being said, some people are like that. And guess what happens when you put accelerant on the fire? What happens is it spreads. The reality is this: some people do like conflict, but most of us don't like conflict. If we could avoid conflict, we would. If somebody woke you up this morning, which would probably cause conflict, but if somebody woke you up this morning and they said, Hey, would you love to have conflict today? You would probably say, I'll pass. And most of us are that way, but the reality is conflict comes in life, and when it does, it's draining. It's very draining. I don't know how many of y'all are drained this morning. I'm physically drained this morning, and probably everybody that went to camp is, and probably everybody that worked this week is, which covers pretty much everybody. We're tired. You're sitting down, which obviously makes you a little bit more tired. And that being said, conflict, though, can drain you more than anything else. It really can. As you go and you're continually fighting something, it brings you down. Sometimes when we're in conflict, it seems as if it keeps us from achieving what we would like to achieve. I think most everybody here probably has goals and dreams. Very few people live life just going, well, my goal is I'm going to make it through tomorrow. Now, that's not a bad thing to do, but most of us have goals and dreams. We have a vision for our life, things that we would like to accomplish, and things that if it ever were to work out, boy, I would love to do this. Maybe I would love to have this, and so forth. In doing so, it's good for us to realize that our day builds toward the big picture. You know, sometimes I think because we don't feel that we can do everything, we should do nothing. But then conflict comes, and we go, how in the world does this help us get from here to here? In Joseph's life, it had to seem that way. Joseph had this dream, and in his dream, he had the dream that ultimately his brothers would bow down to him. Now, that's a pretty significant dream, and honestly, if I had that dream, I probably wouldn't share that with my brothers. He did. And I wouldn't go to my brother and say, I have this dream. And one day, I'm going to rule you. My brother knocked my head off. He would, lovingly, but he would. Because no man likes to hear somebody else say, one day you're going to serve me, much less your younger brother. But he had this dream that God had given him, and the dream was of God. It sounds like this is just some arrogant, made-up dream, but the dream that Joseph has is of God. However, throughout Joseph's life, as we have seen, and as we'll continue to see this morning, throughout Joseph's life, there were all sorts of things that did not lend itself to the fulfillment of that dream. We find Jacob in Jacob's life, Jacob, his father, Joseph's father, who had 4 wives, Leah, Rachel, Zilpah, and Bilhah. Those were his wives. And he had, Joseph had brothers that were his stepbrothers, and he ultimately eventually had a full brother. He had 4 mothers living in his home. One was his mom, and then 3 stepmothers, and it was a little bit of a mess of a situation. However, Jacob showed favoritism to Joseph, and it caused problems. Typically, when you show favoritism to someone, it causes problems. And I understand this as people. We're normally drawn to different people. We could have we could have subject A and subject B, and some people would be more drawn to subject A, and some people would be drawn to subject B. You see that all the time in like political races. I just really like them. Why? Because you're drawn to them. And here we find, though, that he had showed favoritism. Even though you're drawn to someone, you shouldn't play favorites. But Jacob didn't just do that on accident. It was taught to him. In fact, this is something I want to point out from our Bible reading from last week, Genesis chapter 27. In Genesis chapter 27, we find the story of Esau, and Jacob's dad is about to die. And he's going to bless Esau. Now, we know that the chapter 4, Jacob got the birthright from Esau. However, we find that Isaac was going to bless Esau, and Esau had to go out and he had to kill an animal. He had to dress it. He had to fix it for his father and give it to his father, and his father was going to bless him. Well, their mom heard about that. And Isaac loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob the most. They both, in essence, played favorites. In doing so, she was very dishonest, and she got Jacob to go. She fixed up food. He dressed himself in a way, he smelled in a way, he acted in a way that as if he was Esau, and they tricked the father into giving him the blessing. Now, I want to point this out. Jacob's mom is Joseph's grandmother. So his mother showed him favoritism. He showed his son favoritism. And I know ultimately it was the providence of God, but I wonder if her favoritism is part of what led Joseph to being sold into slavery. And I wonder how many times we don't realize, and you know this, especially those of you who are grandparents, I think grandparents love their grandchildren even probably more than their children, and I understand the reasoning behind that, but I mean, they at least they spoil them more. And the reality is this. Joseph's grandmother, I believe, had a part in the guilt of the way Jacob raised Joseph, that favoritism. Does that excuse it? No, and we got to understand that just because we have been taught the wrong way doesn't mean we should continue therein. And I know sometimes it's easier for us who have had a great heritage to go, and say to the other one that, hey, you haven't had a great heritage, but you got to stand. But the reality is true, and you have to begin that heritage. But we need to realize when we plant these seeds, it may harm the ones that we care about the most. Do you think it was easy for Joseph's grandmother, if she was still alive in the time, to think that her grandson was dead? I wonder if there wasn't some baggage and guilt there as she saw the favoritism and then she saw the brothers hating them. But as we look at Joseph's life, these things don't lend to Joseph being a ruler over his brethren. Then he goes and checks on his brothers who hate him. They hate him much more. They decide they want to kill him. They throw him into a pit. This doesn't seem like something that should lend toward this dream being fulfilled. It makes no sense. And then he gets sold into slavery. Then he gets sold again. And then before long, he's such a great man and God was with him. He finds himself rising in the ranks, and then he's falsely accused, and then he finds himself in prison. This just doesn't make sense. Then we find him and he's in prison. God uses him in prison. Wow, it looks like everything's going good. The person I interpreted the dream for gets out. He's going to remember me, and then for 2 years he's forgotten. He finally gets out. He interprets the dream for Pharaoh. He finds himself in a place of great prominence. And then as we're going to look at this morning in this morning's sermon, guess what comes to pass? His brothers come, and his brothers bow before him, and he has dominion over them. Now, as we look at our story, and as we face life, and as we find ourselves in difficult situations, it's important that we realize, first of all, difficulties are a part of life. That is a part of life. Sometimes we go, I don't know why this happens to me. Well, number one, I can tell you why it happens to us, because sin entered into the world. And difficulties that happen to you may not be because of your sin, but they are because of sin. I dislike greatly when people do this, and I know I've fallen into this trap before. When someone's going through a difficult time, well, I know why. You probably don't. Well, I know why. They fall into sin. That's why that's happened. They said that about Job too. But I do know that difficulties are a part of life because of sin. And they are a part of life. We're not unique when we face difficulties. The Bible says there's no temptation that ultimately it's common to man. Nothing has faced you that's not common to man. By the way, Christ went through it all. And he did it without sin. And so as we look at this, the temptations are common to us. Difficulties are a part of life. And we as adults, we realize that more than anyone else. As kids, they believe that their life is supposed to be perfect. By the way, a lot of times kids believe their life is perfect. They look at everybody else and go, man, your life's messed up. I've got it made. And that is true because their parents have done a great job of protecting them and training them. And then eventually, as they get older and as they deal with their own problems, rather than their parents protecting them from the problems, they realize, guess what? Difficulties come. But this is what I want us to realize this morning, and this is really the main point that I want to drive home this morning is this. God is at work in the midst of our conflict. God is at work when we're going through difficulties. This is what we often try to do. Oftentimes, we try to hide our difficulties. You ever heard the fake it till you make it? I've mentioned that many times, and oftentimes we try to fake like everything's going on and hide the difficulties and act as if there's no difficulties, but internally we are struggling in the midst of our difficulties. We don't realize how anything good's coming from them. We know the verse, and we know that all things work together for the good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. And it's easy for us to quote that when we're not going through difficulties. But as we're going through conflict, and as we're going through these difficulties, and as we're having great and intense collisions with one another, whether it be believers or non-believers, as we have these intense, it's hard for us to see the good. And can I say, we won't always realize the good while we're going through the difficulty. In fact, we may not always understand the good after we've gone through the difficulty. But one day we will see the good. This week at camp, I had the opportunity to preach to the entire group there on Thursday afternoon. And I mentioned this by means of introduction as I was laying the groundwork that I may just simply been preaching to one person. And I really don't know who was helped through it all, but I do realize this, that if one was, that's all that really mattered. And I mentioned I don't know who it was that preached a message from the Word of God when Brother Lloyd responded. In fact, for all I know, they may be out of the ministry, and they may be bitter, and they may be sad and depressed and all that, but there was some good done that day. And now Brother Lloyd has been the camp director for 20 years, and it's amazing to see all the different things that have been accomplished over those 20 years. Have many people gone by the wayside? You better believe it. But are there many in the ministry serving God? You better believe it. I know Monday and Tuesday night alone, there were 2 pastors there that had been camp had been instrumental in their life, because Brother Lloyd was, honestly, you say, well, somebody else would have run the camp, maybe, but not the same. And the reality is true that I don't know where that preacher is. He may not see the good that's been worked out, but we as people who have benefited from it have. And what a blessing, and what a great thing, and what a wonderful thing it is to know that God uses people, because God is at work for the good to them that love him, for the good to them who are called according to his purpose. And so as we looked here, we found Jacob, and we mentioned his family, his 12 sons lived in Canaan. Joseph was only 17 years old, and as a young person, he went through difficulty. And I think sometimes we think, well, all right, I went through my difficulty now and my difficulty's over. Because I think pretty much everybody here had difficulties in their teenage years. And everybody could tell their story. They really could. I think everybody here could tell a story about how difficult your teenage years were. You faced different problems. You had internal problems as you struggled with settling different things. You may have had spiritual problems. You may have had physical problems, health problems. You may have been aggravated and picked on and bullied and those sort of things and all these different things. You may have had family relationship issues as a teenager and all those things. And you would love to think once you got out of your teenage years, you're married now and you've got your family, that all your difficulties are behind you. And guess what happens? You face more difficulties. And then you get through those periods of time, and then you face more difficulties, and you face more difficulties. And I hate to tell you this, but your difficulties are not done until you see the one who saved your soul in eternity. Your difficulties aren't done. Till you pass away, your difficulties are not done. But God's at work during the difficulties. In fact, we find this time and time again in the Word of God, this truth. Do you know most beauty comes out of difficulties? It really does. In fact, what I actually preached on, and I never preached this particular before, and what I preached on Thursday was this. What makes the difference of whether or not we are useless or great in the eyes of God is how we respond when God calls us. And pretty much everybody that's been called by God to do anything, or God's moved upon your heart to do anything, there is a self-imposed usually, or other person-imposed pressure that you face. And how do you respond to that when you face the pressure? And we looked... And I'll go through these quickly because it lends to this morning's lesson. Abraham, I guarantee you he felt some pressure when God called him just to leave everything he knew to be comfortable. The reality is we get comfortable. Do you know why you love your home? You're comfortable there. I'm comfortable at my home like I'm not comfortable anywhere else. What I mean by that is I am very comfortable at home. I can rest at home. I can nobody cares if I walk around without my socks at home, and those sort of things. It's comfortable. You're comfortable there. Now, my parents' home used to be my home, but I'm not comfortable at my parents' home like I used to be comfortable at my parents' home. You know why? Because I don't live there anymore. Now, I'm more comfortable at their house than I am your house because they're my family and I used to live there. And I know that when they say make yourself at home, they mean it. You know, a lot of times we say that, we don't really mean it. You know that? Hey, just make yourself at home. What would you do if when you said that, they just suddenly walked over there and started pulling stuff out of the cupboards and started fixing their own meal like they do at home? You would probably play it off, but you'd probably go, man, you don't really. What if they just started taking off their shoes and their socks? No, you'd be kind of like, oh, okay, well, amen. You would play it off, but oftentimes we say that. We don't really. What if they went and laid down in your bed? Oh, man, we say those things and we don't really mean them. We don't really. What if they just went and hopped in your vehicle and took it for a cruise? Big D. What if they went out there and tried to start your car up? Oh, man, you'd shoot them. No, we say those things, but we don't really mean them, And the reality is at home you're comfortable. You know what you have. You know how it works. In fact, half of the stuff you have is probably rigged. You ever notice that? You have something, you think it works perfect till you try to explain to somebody how to use it. And you're like, well, you've got to hold this down and do this and that. And you're like, man, I guess it isn't perfect. But anyway, you're comfortable at home and God told him to leave everything. Boy, that was difficult. But you know what God was doing? He was working things out for good. Moses' story is tremendous, and that's the main passage we used on Thursday. Moses' story is tremendous. He was born in a time in which he should have been put to death. And his mother saw that he was a goodly child, and she saved him. And after a while, she realized she could not hide him anymore, so she made a little ark, and she put him where she was supposed to put him, outside the ark when he was first born. His sister watched, and Pharaoh's daughter came and found him, decided she wanted to raise him as her own child. However, the problem was she needed someone to nurse the child, and guess who was available? Moses' mother. However, throughout his formidable years, he was raised as an Egyptian. He found out he wasn't an Egyptian, and he realized those people that were in bondage were his people. And the Bible tells us in Hebrews, he chose rather to suffer the affliction. He chose affliction. I guarantee you it wasn't easy, though. He didn't always like it. In fact, during his young years, he saw an Egyptian beating on and abusing one of the Hebrews, and he killed the man. Now, that's a difficult time of life. He killed a man. And so what did he have to do? He had to flee, and he became a shepherd for a long, long, long time. Here is this brilliant man. Moses was a brilliant man. He was trained in the best of schools. He was a very smart man. He was the one that God would use to lead his children out of bondage. And guess what he was doing for a long time? Watching sheep. A job that David as a young boy did. That's what he did. This great mastermind, that's what he did. And I guarantee you, it wasn't enjoyable, but one day he saw a burning bush. He saw a bush that was not consumed. It burned and burned and burned, but it did not burn up. It was not consumed, and God called him. And boy, there was that pressure. But how did he respond? He responded in following God. And all those difficulties didn't seem to make sense. All the plagues didn't seem to make sense. All these, it would think Moses would go back, see Pharaoh, say, "Let my people go," and Pharaoh go, "Okay, sure, see you later. Nice knowing you." No, it didn't work that way. It was difficult, but all these things worked together for good. In fact, as we read the Bible, we find the providence of God, and we see how God orchestrates things, and he doesn't always write the story the way we would have. But I'll be honest with you, if we wrote the story, it'd probably be pretty boring. Do you know what makes a book so interesting? Conflict. Conflict. I like mysteries. I really do. Did you know there's not a possibility of a mystery without a conflict? Growing up, I read the Boxcar Children. I don't know if anybody knows those aren't as popular, but the Boxcar Children, I love those books. Benny was the best. Anyway, and then, that's because he was the youngest and I was the youngest. But anyway, and then there were the Hardy Boys. I love the Hardy Boys. I read all 52 books they had at the library here. And I read the Nancy Drews. I read the Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys together, though they were kind of dumb because they tried to put too much into one book. I love the mysteries. And even today, every now and then, I do a lot of non-fictional reading, a lot of Bible reading and so forth. But every now and then, I'll pick up a fictional book just to sort of, you can read them, and it's not like you're having to learn anything. It's just refreshing to your brain. And boy, I love those. But in every one of them, there was conflict. That's what makes it interesting. For the women who they like love stories. And, the reality is, it seems like there's always a conflict. There is. And the reality is some of the best things come out of conflict. In Joseph's life, though he may not have been thankful during the times that he was going through the conflict, he realized at the end that his brothers meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Aren't you thankful for the good that God has worked in your life? My question, though, for us this morning is, are we thankful for the process that got us there? Sports. I like sports. We had a lot of basketball at camp this year. A lot of basketball at camp. And we have the honor and privilege of having one of the champions here with us today. Anyway, John was on the championship team, and I'll mention that here in a little bit too. But I don't know how many basketball games. We never figured it up. I got to figure out how to figure it up. Brother Lloyd couldn't figure out how to figure up how many games we actually played, because there was two leagues. There was the A League and the B League. And the B League had 6 teams, and each team played each other. And then the A League had, I think it was 9 teams, and each team played each other. There was 10 teams. Okay, 10 teams, and they all played each other. Now, you can't just do 10 times 10, because as one team's playing the other team, they're both playing. So one of these days, I'm going to figure out. It was a lot of games, though. A lot of games, because I reffed about half of them. And I'm like, oh, there's another one? There's another one, and it was a lot of basketball. Now, for that, they didn't necessarily do practicing and conditioning, but for a regular basketball team, you have to. For cross country, you have to practice. For all these different sporting events, you have to practice. And I'm going to tell you, it's very refreshing when you win a game and you beat a game, simply because maybe you weren't better than them talent-wise, but physically you were better than them. When it comes to like cross country running, it's not about who's the fastest normally. It's about who can endure the longest when it comes to those real long runs. And in basketball, I know our teams weren't, I was never necessarily extremely physically fit, but we could outlast a lot of the other teams. Now, we never went to our coach and said, "Coach, thank you for just giving us the instruction to run 2 suicides. We're ready to go." No, you hated them. You hated them. I hate the drill I hated the most, but taught me the most, was a drill that the gym, of course, wider than our auditorium here, but the gym you would have to run side to side, sprint it, and you would have to do it a certain number of times within a certain period of time. And if you didn't make it, you didn't have to run punishment laps. You had to do it again until you made it. And what we learned in that is you can push yourself further than you think you can. But what you also learned in that is it was hard to do. But those times is what prepared us to beat the teams who didn't go through that. There are a lot of times in life, God is preparing us for something. And God is moving the pieces to get us there. And though it may not feel comfortable, realize this: God is at work even in the midst of conflict. As your life faces conflict, as difficulties come, as problems come, realize this: God is at work in your life. Now, here's a reality. We can reject it. We can hate every minute of it. We can complain through it. We can grumble. But the Bible tells us to do exactly the opposite. The Bible tells us to do all things without murmurings and disputings. All things. You know, there are certain things that I think sometimes, we'll say, well, I think you understand why I'm complaining. I probably do. My flesh does. And I think your flesh understands sometimes when I complain, but the Bible says, God says, do all things without murmurings and disputings. And when we look at it, one of the reasons why I can understand sometimes when you complain and you can understand sometimes when I complain is this: you've gone through it. And you know what you did when you went through the same thing? You complained, right? God says do all things without murmurings and disputings, and we can't look at him and go, you don't understand, because he does. And Jesus Christ went through the crucifixion without complaining. Now, and when we face difficulties, and one of the things I have learned over the last few years is don't minimize different people's difficulties. Because if it wasn't difficult for them, then they wouldn't be complaining about it. I was convicted one time. I had a student who was working on something. It was supposed to be a fun page. But I've learned sometimes those fun things that they throw in there that they say is for fun in your educational courses, sometimes those are the most annoying things ever. But on his fun page, it was a crossword puzzle. And the way you had to fill out this crossword puzzle, there was a trivia about presidents. And he raises his hand, and I think this was my first year teaching, and he raises his hand and goes, "Hey, Mr. Leathers, I need some help with this." And this kid was a very smart kid and he was a great student. And I need some help with this. And I sat down, and the first thing out of my mouth was, "Oh, this is easy." And the student just kind of looked at me like, "No, it's not." and as soon as I said it, it was convicting. You know those times when you open your mouth and as soon as you say it, you're like, "Ooh, did I say that out loud?" He wouldn't have been asking me for help if it was easy. It was easy for me. I had different circumstances than he did. I had different educational opportunities than he did and so forth. And though I looked at it and go, "This is a piece of cake," he looked at it and goes, "This is between me and graduating and I'll never make it." And he go, "Really?" He was going to make it just fine. Maybe, but in that moment, he felt like it was the most difficult thing he's ever faced. And those, we may look at different things, and you see a kid trying to ride a bicycle, and they look at it like, "Am I ever going to be able to ride on a bike with two wheels?" And you're like, it's easy. That's because you've already gone through what they've gone through. So one thing we have to remember is as we look at each other's difficulties that they're going through and different battles and struggles they face, we have to realize that though it may not seem that big to us, it's really big to them. You ever seen someone, I see this often, and I've unfortunately experienced this in my life, but especially with kids, you're trying to get them to eat something they don't want to eat. And I figured something out, by the way. I told my wife this, I think, yesterday. I figured out why I don't like vegetables. Every time I've had a seizure, I've bitten a huge chunk out of my tongue. I bit out the vegetable portions. That's what I did. I don't have the taste buds for it anymore. It's a medical condition. The only problem is I didn't like them before I had the medical condition. But anyway, it's a medical condition. I need my exemption from vegetables. No, but little kid, you don't even make, it's not like, here's this head of lettuce, eat it. No, you give them like 3 bites. You give them maybe a piece of broccoli or something, or maybe they've eaten a couple, but there's that last piece. There's something about the last piece that's so much more difficult than the first 4 or 5 pieces. You ever notice that? And they're looking at it. And you see this one little tiny bite, but they see a garden full. They really do. And it's like, oh, I can't do it. It's like they're so full they can't even, if you get it in their mouth, they can't swallow it. Because to them, it seems so much bigger. And we step back and go, it's not that big of a deal. Got to realize that. Some of the battles we face are massive. There are some battles we look at and go, wow, I know God's grace is sufficient, but I'm not sure, other than His grace, how I would get through a situation. Think of Brother Freeman right now. He's struggling. He's in pretty poor condition. He's in the rehab, but unless he can get his strength up, they may have to move him again because he's in the rehab to do the rehab program. And if he can't do the program, obviously they can't just keep him there and so forth. And so be in prayer for him. I have a thing that I want to mention during the sermon about praying for him. Well, I tell you, he's facing some difficulty. He's got cancer pretty much all over him. Man, I look at that and go, wow, that's huge. My buddy up in Kentucky, Brother Tom Otto, I was so proud for him yesterday because he was able to go out and run a mile. He said it wasn't fast, there was no GPS, there was no timing it or whatever, but he was able to do a mile, and that was huge for him, who just a couple months ago was running a half of a marathon because he's faced cancer, and a man who was strong and fit is now pretty weak and frail. And Lord willing, his chemo treatments are over, and Lord willing, he'll be able to regain his strength. But I look at that and go, man, I don't know how. You see other people. Dave McCroskey was supposed to be preaching camp this year, and he sent in a message to Brother Lloyd saying that he was praying for us and so forth. But the reason he didn't preach camp this year was he was just not sure he could emotionally hold himself together to preach 4 sermons at youth camp. He's going through a difficult time. His wife, 24 years old, about 25 years old, passed away, and now he's taking care of his daughter, and he's going through the grieving process. And man, I look at that and go, wow. And you've got your different stories that you could tell, and I've got some stories that I could tell about the biggest difficult times that we've gone through. But realize this, none of them even come close to comparing to the crucifixion that Christ went through for you and I. Also the rejection. I want you to think about this. He was rejected by the people He created. And He did it all without complaining. You know why? He realized this. God is doing a work in the midst of the conflict. All that Jesus went through was God doing His work to redeem mankind. Can I say, as we go through these difficulties, as relationships collide, as sometimes we collide with ourselves, realize this: in the midst of difficulty, in the midst of conflict, God is at work. In other words, we have to look at the big picture. We have to look at the big picture and not just what's happening right now. Yes, look at what's happening right now because it's part of the big picture, but we have to realize that there's a big picture and God is at work even in the midst of conflict.